Once that project is verified, we then move to an issuance of credits from the registry to the landowner. And then we would support that landowner in the sale of those offsets directly to a buyer in a bilateral agreement, which is how most voluntary carbon is sold.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 63 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Manor, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to bring this show to you, and super thankful to you for tuning in. If you're interested in being a sponsor, please feel free to reach out. My email can be found in the description. And if this is your first time with us, please do subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating, as it's very helpful to grow the show. And of course, as always, if you are a founder in the space and are looking to connect, always glad to speak and potentially share leads on partnerships, or if you're looking for funding, feel free to reach out. We are glad to help in any way we can by sharing connections and introductions to our network. Generally speaking, it's our goal to help grow the space, so feel free to reach out. And with that, let's get into the episode details. In today's episode, we are covering all things carbon markets and carbon sequestration inside of the forestry context with Matt Smith from Finite Carbon. Finite Carbon is a platform which helps landowners to get verified carbon credits, as well as connect them with the buyers of those credits. And actually pretty soon they're going to be rolling out something that allows landowners with as little as 40 acres to take part in this market. So it's a really interesting kind of thing what they're doing. And in today's episode, Matt answers several questions, including what is carbon sequestration, is it a scam, how it works, who decides the price, and how do you verify the project. So a lot of really interesting things we went over. I think a lot of people tend to be, or at least I've heard in the space, a lot of skeptics about the carbon sequestration space. So I think it was really good conversation we had with Matt today. Very exciting work they're doing at Finite Carbon in general. So really glad we could bring this episode to you. Before we get into the show, we also want to make, of course, thanks to our sponsors, Next Wave Partners. Next Wave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you are looking for a career change personally, feel free to reach out to Next Wave directly at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. And without any further delay, let's get into the show.
All right, welcome to the show, Matt. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Silas?
I am doing finest frog hair, as my dad always says. I'm glad to be here and extremely excited to have you on the show. Really, really looking forward to this episode, honestly. So I guess to start us off, why don't you just give us a quick kind of summary about your background in general, a little bit about yourself and how you got into the carbon market space.
Sure. Well, I'm a forester. I currently hold the title of Vice President of Forest Operations for Finite Carbon Corporation. I've been in forestry for 36 years. I spent most of my career working for small, non-industrial landowners and gradually moved into carbon. So out of the last 36 years in forestry, 20 of that has been revolving around forest carbon and forest carbon markets. So it's been an interesting path.
So my question is kind of, how did you end up getting into the space, kind of going from forestry to this? Is it just because of the link and somebody presented you an opportunity, or was this something you had been kind of pursuing and ended up going down this rabbit hole?
Well, I joke with folks in my profession that if you'd told me 15 years ago that this is where I'd be sitting and making my living in forest carbon, I would have politely told you were crazy. I really entered the carbon space at the behest of my clients. At the time, I was managing institutional timberland, which was answering to a body of investors that are interested in high performance and sustainability. And so, shifts in timber production, acknowledging non-timber related values, represents a cost to traditional timberland management without that emphasis. And so many of those clients were looking for a way to develop alternative return drivers to cover some of those opportunity costs that were represented by that move to sustainability. So at their behest, I started investigating, and I guess I dipped my toe in the pool and fell right in.
Interesting. That's usually how it plays out. It's not so much dipping, more so diving.
Yeah,
Okay, that's interesting. So could you maybe, for people who are unfamiliar, and I'm one of them, I'm not highly familiar with how this works. Could you give us a quick overview of maybe the entire kind of carbon sequestration kind of space in general, and how does this carbon credit, this term that a lot of people throw around right now, how does this actually work? And then really specifically would like to kind of dig down into how does it work in the timber setting?
sure. So big question. It's no short answer, and I frequently say there are no short discussions in carbon, but I'll do my best. Uh, we've got an environmental problem. We've got an environmental problem with climate change and greenhouse gas emissions exacerbating that issue, and so time is not on our side. The world needs to act. We need to begin the process of decarbonization now in order to avoid some of the potentially devastating impacts of this issue down the road. So one way of accomplishing those goals of a decarbonized economy is to reduce point source emissions. And that is ultimately the goal of all carbon programs. Stop the bleeding at the stack. And that can take a variety of forms. It could be new technologies. It could be product substitution. It could be alternative fuels. There's a whole host of tools in the toolbox to accomplish that goal. But many of those engineering type solutions, many of those product substitution type solutions take time. And like I said, time is not on our side. We can achieve very comparable emission reductions through alternative actions. And there's about 170 different offset project types out there, activities that can be taken to take in and store carbon dioxide or avoid the emission of greenhouse gases in other sectors. It could be coal mine gas capture. It could be landfill gas capture. It could be ozone depleting substances. It could be a whole host of different activities. One body of offset project activities that is very, very pertinent to our company is natural climate solutions. That would be land use and land use change. It'd be forestry and agriculture and other comparable similar type activities. So forests, by their very nature, take in and store carbon dioxide in trees for a considerable length of time. And forest owners that are willing to make commitments to defer harvest and prolong that storage in those trees on the stump, or make investments in a forest to make to realize additional climate gains through rapid growth, are able to quantify those changes, quantify those instruments, and express them to the market in the form of an offset. An offset only works if it's equivalent. And so developing offsets really puts our industry in a place where we have to be very credible. We have to produce very defensible claims and quantification of carbon offsets to meet those equivalency objectives. So that's a little bit about how forestry takes part in this market. We have really a two-part market. We have a compliance market in this country that is primarily in the state of California, where they've regulated emitters in a variety of sectors and required them to reduce their emissions and greenhouse gas footprint. They allow for offset projects to sell into that market from all over the country. Then we have the voluntary market, which dominates the space right now. The voluntary market for carbon offsets is selling offsets to corporations or entities that have made carbon neutral targets for themselves, maybe carbon neutral by 2030, carbon neutral by 2050, those kinds of things. And they're using offsets to achieve many of those objectives. So those are the two spaces we operate in.
Okay, interesting. So I guess one thing I'm kind of curious to understand is what are the typical objections to doing this? Because I know there's a lot of people out there who say, "Oh, what happens if you capture the carbon, and once you cut the trees down, then what happens to them?" So could you walk through that process?
Yeah. So there's a body of folks out there that are just flat out against offsets. They want reductions at the point source and only at the point source, and aren't interested in recognizing the equivalency of a ton of CO2 taken in by a forest versus a ton of CO2 avoided by a smokestack. So there, there's not much we can do to sway those kinds of folks. They're having a problem with that core argument of equivalency.
Okay.
On the forest sector, there's a lot of controversy. A lot of it revolves around the estimation of carbon baselines, and I'll come back to that term here in a minute. But it also, focuses on buffer pools and insurance mechanisms to guard forests against natural change. That could be large events like a forest fire. It could be wind. It could be a tornado. It could be an insect infestation where all of that carbon that was paid for and stored is now emitted to the atmosphere unexpectedly. So let me go back to baseline. So in carbon speak, in my industry, a baseline is an expression of what could or would have happened in the absence of the carbon project. So each registry, each methodology, or cookbook, so to say, of how to build an offset project expresses those baselines in different ways. Some express them on the premise of what would have happened. So this landowner harvested conservatively historically. So we're going to say that conservative approach to harvesting would continue in the absence of the project. Or it could be an aggressive baseline where it would say, well, what could happen in the absence of the project would be potentially a depletion of the forest stocks. Maybe the land changes hands and that forest is depleted at a fairly rapid rate. You can see where the baselines in those two instances would have drastically different outcomes and would credit more carbon to that aggressive baseline and less carbon to the conservative baseline. So that's a point of emphasis. And at our company, at Finite Carbon, we strive to be the gold standard for quality and integrity in the space. And in what has become a largely self-regulated industry in the voluntary carbon market, it's imperative that we meet the need of corporate interests and industry by delivering offsets. But in doing so, we have to do it in a very credible way. And so conservative approaches to baselines are something that we advocate for. But when it comes to the buffer pool, there's a lot of focus on wildfires in the West. There's been press around wildfires and how they relate to compliance projects in the California program. That's a real risk, and buffer pools are important. There's a lot of things happening with buffer pools out there in the space right now. And I think it's really important, and our position is to advocate that each individual project needs to contribute its own offset credits to the buffer pool in order to maintain credibility and transparency. So we try to address those concerns on the part of outside interests by just holding the line and saying, just because we can do a project a certain way doesn't mean we should. And it's really imperative that we raise the bar.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. That seems pretty clear how it all works. I guess what I'm curious about is if you could walk us through the kind of an example of the typical parties, right? So, this type of company that does this, they're buying this, and then this person's getting paid. Just kind of the process of who's buying, who's receiving the money, how it all works actually, kind of from a financial perspective.
Sure. So it all starts with the landowner, right? The landowner owns the land. They have fee title to the land. They make decisions every day on what happens with the carbon stocks on that land. Frequently, those folks are working with a forester, and that's a good thing. But that's where the developer comes in. Developing an offset project takes a very specific set of skills and a significant financial investment. And that's where groups like Finite Carbon come in to try to bridge those gaps. So we come in, we work with the forester and the landowner to assess the feasibility of a project on their lands, to talk to them about how we approach baselines, about what our marketing strategy would be for them. And if they choose to go ahead with a project, we're a turnkey solution. So we would come in, we would work with their forester again to devise an inventory. We have to measure, we have to monitor carbon stocks over the life of these contracts. And so data is a very important part of that. We would go ahead and implement that inventory, develop that project. There's a bunch of modeling that needs to be done. There's project documentation that needs to be done. We would then deliver that project as a completed offset project to a carbon registry. And that carbon registry would certify our results through the use of a third-party verifier. So independent verifiers or auditors come in to audit the credibility of our carbon claims and the compliance of our project to the registry standard. So registries are the cookbook holders. They write the rules, they maintain the rules for both project verifications and project development to a variety of different methodologies. Once that project is verified, we then move to an issuance of credits from the registry to the landowner. And then we would support that landowner in the sale of those offsets directly to a buyer in a bilateral agreement, which is how most voluntary carbon is sold.
Interesting. So there's kind of the upfront certification process to essentially verify that there is such thing as a credit on that property. Then these are essentially issued to the property owner, and then they in turn can sell them either through you or, in some cases probably to other people, not through you, right? So you're the marketplace and you're helping people get verified, and you're the marketplace for them.
That's right. That's right.
Interesting. And then of course, because I think I've seen a lot of marketplaces from the other side, right? Whereas a lot of people for corporates purchasing or for individuals, I've seen some. So I think it's interesting. One thing I noticed that seemed interesting to me, and I had never thought about it, obviously I'm not in the space, but is on your website, it mentions that pretty soon at some point, even somebody with as little as 40 acres could look at doing something like this. Could you talk about, I guess, what does it look like traditionally to do this, and what are you basically bringing to the table that can allow that to happen, and how is this going to affect the industry as a whole, and what are going to be the outcomes from it?
I'm really glad you asked that question. Since our beginning in 2009, we set out to be the experts, to be the preferred source of forest carbon offsets. And we've done that. We've done over 51 projects. We've delivered almost 90 million offsets and generated 800 million in revenue to deliver to forest owners across the country. That's the good news. The tough part of that message is that has largely been for large forest holdings and large forest landowners. The market has really passed by the opportunity to deliver a solution to smaller landowners who dominate the landscape. They own most of the forest land in the country and are a very, very important part of our carbon flux. So, it takes a lot of innovation. We took our experience over the last 14 years and put it to work to develop innovative new solutions using technology. We had two main barriers to scaling this down to small landowners. One is the cost of inventory. Two is the cost of verification. So we went to work with a team of data scientists and found that we had some technological solutions using remote sensing, using satellite imagery and ground data to develop a technological solution to carbon inventory for the entire country. And so our manifestation of that is through our platform that is going to be launching soon called Core Carbon, C-O-R-E Carbon. So what Core does is it's a platform that small landowners can log on to. They can enter some information about their property. They'll be taken to a map of their property where they'll verify their parcels that they own. They can then draw on screen and outline portions of their property to enroll in a harvest deferral forest carbon project. And while they do so, receive real-time quotes for the carbon value that portion of their property will deliver to them annually for the length of the contract. Again, we feel very, very adamantly that quality is imperative here. It's easy to scale things down. It's hard to scale things down in a manner that maintains the integrity and quality that buyers are expecting out there. So we worked with the American Carbon Registry and wrote a methodology with them called the small landowner methodology, and it's available on their website. This methodology recognizes the carbon uptake and storage of going from forests that are commercially available for harvest to a non-harvest condition. So a landowner is agreeing to not harvest those trees for a period of time in compliance with the methodology and the American Carbon Registry expectations. So one thing that's exciting about our platform is that it puts forest owners directly in touch with buyers. One of the problems with some of the comparable solutions out there are that they have to wait for an auction, or they have to develop their project and then wait to see what the price is on the back end. What CORE does is it lays out the terms in advance. The forest owner gets to determine what parts of their property they want to enroll. They know exactly what their payments are going to be. They'll know exactly what the terms are going to be, and they'll receive their payments through Core Carbon and can manage their project going forward under that platform. So we're really excited that we were able to use technology and some innovative solutions to tear down some of the cost barriers, maintain a very high quality project, and deliver price and transaction transparency to a body of forest owners that haven't had that before.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I'm kind of curious about is, in most cases, are these existing kind of properties that they're just going to kind of make that commitment not to harvest, or are they oftentimes planting new trees?
So offset projects come in different types. And in forest carbon speak, we have what are called improved forest management projects. That means that the change to the project activity represents an improvement in the carbon outcome versus traditional management. And this harvest deferral project would be one of those. The market also recognizes tree planting or afforestation, reforestation projects. They are very exciting. There's a ton of interest around these. CORE is really developed to support multiple kinds of project activity. So if you will, a landowner down the road would be able to manage their bottomland hardwoods in a harvest deferral program. They might manage their upland forests in an improved forest management program that includes harvesting. And then they may have some vacant agricultural land that they decide to reforest, and they would be able to manage that under CORE as well. So we're building it to grow. We're building it to grow and expand, but starting with this first harvest deferral project type.
Mm-hmm. I'm out of curiosity. I don't know if this might be kind of confidential information, but are there things that can be done? So say, for example, I'm somebody with 80 acres, 120 acres somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, and I just have this tree sitting here. I may or may not harvest them in the coming years for income. And I'm deciding, hey, I want to reach out to Finite Carbon to understand about this. Are there things that can be done to improve the kind of the carbon, as you mentioned, the carbon outcome, I think is what you called it, of this land? Or is it just kind of mainly that commitment? Or are there other things that are actually done kind of to improve the outcome?
Foresters for generations have been working with small private landowners and industrial landowners to groom and improve and foster growth in the forest setting. Mm-hmm. Good forestry yields optimal results in carbon as well. What's done with that forest outside of that typical sustainable forest management context to realize carbon gains is kind of a different but related story. So really it comes down to, in this case, what could have happened in the absence of the project? You could have decided to harvest that forest over the next 40 years in Wisconsin, but by agreeing to defer your harvest, you no longer have that option in lieu of the carbon payment you're going to receive. So, but for the carbon revenue, you wouldn't have made that long-term commitment to defer harvest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. So in the case of there is no forest management going on, it's just kind of a plot of land, it's just sitting there. Maybe some improvements can be made, but largely also it's going to be that commitment that says we're not going to chop these down for X period of time, and you'll get those carbon credits as a result.
That's right. Most carbon programs recognize carbon on a forest in two ways. One is valuation of the current stock that's on the forest at the beginning of the project and the commitment not to emit it. So those are avoided harvest
Yeah.
credits, so to speak. What happens after the project starts is that each year the forest grows. And so there's an annuity stream. It's a different type of credit. It's an uptake in storage credit. It's a growth credit. The market is starting to value these two credits differently. And for instance, deferred harvest credits are typically valued slightly less than new removals that occur due to growth going forward. So it's interesting that the market is looking to the qualities of those two activities and valuing them differently.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And then what is the typical timeline that people are usually kind of committing to not harvest? Is there a specific timeline that usually goes and then they still end up going on to harvest eventually?
Yeah, there is. So the American Carbon Registry's standard contract term is 40 years. Under the core carbon platform, the methodology allows for a landowner to make a decision at year 20 or halfway through that contract. So what we've done is everyone that signs up for core carbon agrees to defer their harvest for the first 20 years. But at year 20, they may have the opportunity to say, well, carbon's not working out for me very well. The prices aren't there anymore. It's really not working out. I would like to resume harvesting, but I want to maintain my commitment. So they know they have to maintain their contract for an additional 20 years to fulfill the 40. They can go back to harvesting annual growth above the carbon stock at that time and work their way out of the project, okay? On the contrary, if carbon is doing well and they would like to continue deferring their harvest, they can make that decision at year 20 to re-up, continue to defer, continue to receive carbon payments, and fulfill their 40-year contract that way. We tried to build some sensible flexibility into this. I'm a forest owner myself. I know that life happens. 40 years is a long time for a guy in his mid-50s. And so, we have to provide some flexibility. Other things we've done to provide flexibility is give landowners a chance to harvest some personal use wood, so like firewood off of their forest, but also if they choose, receive a slightly lower carbon payment for the option of clearing small areas. Maybe their nephew wants to put in a cabin one day, or maybe they choose to put a pond in one day. We need to maintain flexibility in carbon programs to allow for the typical uses of forest land that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, being from Wisconsin, as I mentioned before the show,
You're on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah, I was saying,
can hear
I think it makes sense. Being from Wisconsin, as I mentioned before the show, these kind of things would definitely come up with the people I know who would be interested in these projects, right? They're like, oh, well,
Sure.
I can't commit to that for 20, 30, 40 years, right? So that's interesting. You mentioned earlier about the verification and measurement of these projects, obviously at the beginning, and I'm assuming throughout. What does that look like? Is that something that's kind of installed on the property on a regular basis to stay there, or is it just regular checkups? Like, how does that actually work?
Historically, our industry has been dominated by actual field measurement, putting foresters out on the landscape on a random sample approach. They have assigned coordinates that they have to physically visit. And when they do, we put in permanently monumented, what we call continuous forest inventory plots. These are highly precisely measured plots to quantify the carbon stock and populate databases with the data we need to use forest growth simulators. So in between measurement periods, which can be 5 to 10 years, where we would return to these same plots and measure them again and inspect change. In between, we model growth and having the data necessary to run those models thoughtfully is a really integral part of the carbon accounting process for a forest. Things are changing though. Core carbon is a great example. The core is one of a few examples of remotely sensed inventory being used to quantify carbon stocks in the forest. I regularly, in my day-to-day activities, interface with new technologies, drone-based inventory approaches, multi-sensor arrays, in the forest doing inventory. We're getting to LiDAR-based solutions that represent more of a census of the forest, an individual tree inventory of the entire forest than a random sample. This technology is moving very rapidly, far more rapidly than the carbon programs and registries that are there to set side rails on their use. So it's an interesting place to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting to see. I think I'm always very fascinated by the availability of data and kind of increasing that visibility for people to solve problems. In this case, it's not necessarily as much of a problem that we're seeking solutions inside of, but to solve the existing problem. So I think it's quite interesting. One thing I'm a little bit curious about is, we talked about how right now you're kind of working on this new product that will help smaller landowners, kind of the individuals rather than institutions, to partake in the carbon markets. What has been the role really of institutions in making this carbon market a reality, kind of from the perspective of corporates looking to purchase offsets and making these voluntary commitments, as you mentioned earlier? I'm just kind of curious if you wouldn't mind giving a quick history of how this ended up playing out and where it looks like it's going.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to 2003. This is when I was first starting in forest carbon and in carbon markets, and it began with an initiative called the Chicago Climate Exchange. And the Chicago Climate Exchange was a pilot project where industry volunteered to come to the table and develop a trading platform for greenhouse gas instruments to be used to hopefully avert federal regulation, but also to meet climate objectives and corporate responsibility programs that they had for product lines or corporate image overall. And so it was a grand experiment, and it put a price on carbon. It created an open trading platform and created an atmosphere where credits could be sold and purchased and used and retired, and really set some of the precedents for what we're dealing with today in a more mature setting. So, the thought process behind how or why this would work has been going on for a very, very long time. We are still in an unregulated market. And what we saw in the housing bubble bursting in 2008 and 2009 was that the novelty of carbon trading and corporate responsibility programs quickly took a backseat to corporate survival. And so that was an interesting lesson learned as well. We've rebounded from that and then some. From 2020 to 2021, the voluntary carbon market quadrupled to now a $2 billion a year industry, and that growth has persisted into 2022. So we're dealing with an industry that is in a rapid growth phase. We're looking at the United States government starting to invest money, new climate bills. We're seeing increased interest in awareness, reinvestment. There's massive investment entering this space every day right now. And I think a lot of it is, in a manner to avert pending regulation on this point, to show corporate responsibility and good behavior by initiating their own voluntary carbon targets and climate change targets. And in doing so, have developed a robust market, and one that continues to grow.
Mm-hmm. No pun intended. I think it's quite interesting, actually. I like how this is played out with I'm always very keen to get people's thoughts on the regulatory space, right? On whether or not it's actually beneficial to grow the space, right? Obviously, there would be a lot of people who would be scrambling to get in if there was a regulatory kind of act pushed. But I oftentimes feel that if something is kind of done from the inside and done in earnest, as it seems the carbon market has been, it tends to be pretty good as well. So I guess maybe, do you have any thoughts on that? And if there are regulatory kind of proposals coming down the pipeline that you think are going to come through, and your general thought on whether or not the industry could really benefit from some more regulatory involvement in the near future?
Well, I guess the best way to answer that question, Silas, is to look at what's transpired with our regulatory versus voluntary market already. what did what did the regulatory market do well that we don't see in the current voluntary space? Well, what it does well is define the demand side. They know exactly how many emitters need to cut their emissions. They know exactly by how much. They can quantify and predict that demand going forward. And so all of that makes it a very transparent demand side situation or supply side for supply side to meet. The other thing it did is it set a price floor, which provided price certainty and security for investors in the space. It also provided more transparency in what going prices were. One of the biggest complaints folks have about the voluntary space is it is largely bilateral transactions, closed door transactions that take place, and they are not public. So getting a handle on exactly what your carbon is worth is very difficult today. So what can the federal government do? Well, it can make a fine mess of things, or it can make some intelligent design. I think cap and trade is demonstrating success in scale. It's demonstrating success in folks adopting it and participating in it. We're showing that it can work, and I'm hopeful that that's the route the federal government chooses to take if it does take an action. Back in Bill Clinton's administration, he formally tasked the EPA to consider CO2 a pollutant. And that is what has put the federal government on this trajectory. Now, they recently passed the climate bill in Biden's administration and have injected an enormous amount of money into the space. That's going to do a variety of things. It's going to raise awareness. There's going to be a lot of promotion. There's going to be a lot of education that goes on as a result of that. There's also going to be innovation in the space. And if I can say one thing about the carbon space in my time in it, it has been innovative. It's been something new every year. I think that I don't have a crystal ball on what the federal government will finally do or when. I think that this step is a sound step if they find good, productive ways to spend this money. If they're putting it to use to build market infrastructure, to build transparency, to set us up for a more open, transparent, and value-added voluntary market, that's great. If it also sets the stage for what someday becomes a regulatory market, I think that's an acceptable outcome too.
Mm-hmm. Do you, out of curiosity, do you have any thoughts on I haven't talked about this for a while, but on the carbon tax idea? I think this first came to my mind when I read Tom Rand's book, The Canadian Investor, that he was talking about carbon tax and using that money to then reinvest into climate projects. Do you have any opinion on that and whether or not it works? Or you think it may work?
Well, I mean, obviously I'm an advocate of cap and trade. I think the true solution to the climate change problem needs all the tools in the toolbox. And the tax idea, while interesting, really focuses on reduction of point source emissions to the exclusion of all others. The door for innovation, the door for carbon capture and storage, the door for coal mine methane destruction, all these innovative other technologies and approaches just don't find traction in a carbon tax environment. So I feel pretty strongly that cap and trade is our future. Is the best way to go.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. Okay, maybe shifting just a little bit here. What if somebody wants to get into this space, say they're very interested and they want to, kind of grow with this industry? What would you recommend to kind of a high school graduate looking to start their career and do their education? What would you recommend as the steps they should take and how they should enter into the space?
Well, this is a science and math industry. And if you're strong in science and math, that would be the path. And, it's exciting. I serve as an adjunct professor at College of Forestry at Syracuse, and I work with students that are interested in this new and emerging field. I'm also excited that my college there and others are developing curriculums around climate change, carbon, alternative fuels, on clean tech management specifically. And so there's lots of new curriculums out there to explore, and the with the amount of industry placing money in this space, with the amount of industry in this space, the future's pretty bright if someone goes that route and chooses to invest themselves in that kind of future. It certainly appears as though there'd be plenty of jobs for those folks to find when they're done.
Yeah, this is always interesting to me because I oftentimes think about, based on the people I'm talking to on this show, there's going to be a lot of new jobs, and there's going to be not just a lot of different types of jobs, but many of those, right? And I often wonder how we're going to actually fill all those jobs, right? Because these are very difficult jobs. These aren't necessarily jobs you can just kind of pick up in a week or two, or even a few months of training, right? So I just think it's interesting, especially, from my perspective. I don't necessarily think of forestry as a really kind of a big ticket college item that a lot of people are going for, right? So I think this is interesting. I'm glad we're able to chat about it and maybe bring awareness to it a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think one thing I would be keen to know is also from Finite Carbon's perspective, what are the key things that you tend to look for in talent? Is it actually a specific type of educational background? Is it a certain type of personality type or drive, or what are the typical things or typical types of companies you guys like to hire from?
There's a couple of different schools of thought on that, and it really depends on what part of our business that this individual is choosing to explore. And we have a very tech-heavy side to our company: data, modeling, lidar, remote sensing, programming. These people speak R. They live and breathe data. They think in spreadsheets, and so yeah, we look towards the big name universities and very motivated. We've got several PhDs on staff. We've got most of our folks all have master's degrees. So you've got that side of our company. Then you've got the other side, the side that I'm on, and that side is that's the sales side. That's the consultant side. That's the making things happen in the field side, and that takes a different kind of person. Communication skills are extremely important, verbal and written, being able to interact with folks, to convey complex ideas in simple, meaningful terms that folks can understand is very important. But there's also, the farm kid in me that says you got to be prepared to put your buddy boots on and get out there in the field and weather that snowstorm and collect some very precise data. Be willing to put that time in. Our business, as many others, requires extensive travel. Our company alone, since I started, has developed projects from Alaska to Florida, from Maine to California, and that takes some time away from home. So being flexible to travel is a key criteria. So there's room for a lot of different folks in this space.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I really do like that. I think that approach is interesting. I'm always very fascinated really by the intersection of kind of different industries, like tech specifically with something else, right? Like construction and technology and all these interesting things where they come together and you just wouldn't think of it, especially if you were somebody who grew up in it, and then you're just like, oh, well, think about adding these together and just what kind of mixture can you make there? So I think it's very fascinating. I guess maybe just the last thing to leave us with be keen to hear from your perspective over the next, kind of in the big picture, over the next 5 to maybe 15 years or so. What do you see as some of the biggest things changing, and like how do you see it might look? How do you think it might look at that time for the carbon markets?
Well, I see the continued growth of renewable energy. That we've seen remarkable growth in that sector to date. It's going to continue. It's going to be more money available to make those kinds of things happen. I see less reliance on fossil fuels as part of that outcome. I think that offsets are here for a period. Offsets are tools that we can use to ramp up and achieve decarbonization now, but they have a period for which they will be useful. The future is going to hold some new technology, some new engineering solutions, some changes to how we conduct business that are going to result in decarbonization at rates and at costs beyond what offsets can deliver. So I view offsets and our time with offsets throughout that period, but maybe 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 less so towards the end. We'll have to see. It's going to be interesting to watch. So I see continued growth, and at the rate of investment in this space, it's hard to deny that the innovation is going to continue to unroll. I joke with, my wife jokes. I used to have a full head of curly hair before carbon came along. And it's an interesting and dynamic space. It's a lot of fun to work in, but the future is bright, but it's going to be very different than it is today, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting industry, because it's not one that you look at and you say this is just automatically going to grow. It will grow, obviously, but the result of it growing is at some point a difference in the industry. It's like, I think it's very fascinating what you guys are doing. But anyways, this has been a pleasure to have you on, Matt. I really appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to continuing to see what you guys do in the future.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Silas. And if your listeners want to learn more about us, they can go to finitecarbon.com and corecarbon.com and watch for our press releases as we get prepared to launch Core.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Certainly recommend everybody does follow their LinkedIn page. Perhaps reach out to Matt if you're interested in learning about the property. If you have some of it yourself, I know I'll certainly be mentioning this to some of my family members. So I appreciate it, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. Please let us know what you thought of the show. We're always glad to have feedback or discuss any topics in further detail. Perhaps another topic kind of within the topic could be discussed on the show. And also, please do share this with somebody who might find it interesting. I think that given the nature of what we discuss with even small landowners being able to partake in this market, there could be a lot of people that we all probably know who we could share this with. So please do consider to share it. If you enjoyed the show, of course, we always appreciate a rating as well. And we do really encourage you to reach out to Matt directly on LinkedIn, and then, of course, learn more about Finite Carbon. A quick note on our next episode, we will be joined by Baruz, who is the CEO and co-founder of Burkham Inc., which is helping make plastics more sustainable in general. We talk about what they're doing and the challenges that the plastic industry faces from kind of an innovation standpoint. Very interesting conversation, especially given some of the restraints that it's very difficult for the plastic industry to kind of just pivot very quickly, given that's a pretty capital-intensive kind of process to build these factories, and then changing them is just not quite that easy. So pretty interesting conversation coming up next time. And as always, thank you so much for tuning into the CleanTechies podcast, and we will see you next time on the show.